Yeah, no, thanks for that, and thanks for organising this, which, yeah, it's a really kind of fun provocation, and yeah, quite an exciting topic to explore. So yeah, it's chaotic synthesis and physical modelling. So I'll be talking about a specific synthesis process, like I guess a lot of us are, and I'll talk a bit about that technically and some kind of context for it. But I kind of like to try and keep it a bit broader if possible, because John's opened up really like, you know, we've come out of our kind of show and tell into this broad sphere and kind of exploring what heretical means, authenticity, loads of these kind of interesting discussions have already kind of emerged, and hopefully I can kind of keep them in the air slightly. So I'll try and do that, but we'll see how we go. And so we'll be talking about this little specific synthesis method. But I hope it kind of cross-cuts some of those, like probably everyone's will in some way, cross-cuts some of these bigger themes that are already coming out. So, just in case I forget, I'm going to play a clip of some audio of the synthesis method, just so it gives some context, so I'll then talk about it, so it's kind of not keeping the big reveal till the end or something like that. So I'll just play a little clip. And this is, I call it gutter synthesis, and it's this slightly in between the two keywords in the title, I guess, chaotic synthesis and physical modeling. So, as hopefully it's kind of apparent from listening to it, it's kind of pitched as a sort of, as the way the synthesis sounds in this kind of world between very explicitly digital sort of chaotic processes, but also trying to have some kind of physical aspect. And the motivation for a lot of this work at the time, and this is slightly aging as a project, it probably started in about 2014 and it's been going until maybe last year when there was a CD release and software for other people to use, which there's a link in the next slide if anyone wants that. The motivation was to try and have a system you can kind of push and poke and provoke, like I felt like a lot of acoustic improvisers had. They have these kind of really explorable systems where you can go in and kind of find things after even a long time playing around with it and still go to that and draw on it and explore it in performance or just noodling by yourself or whatever. So that's the kind of motivation, which is not so uncommon, particularly in the world of people working with feedback, for example. And I know we have some practitioners here who've explored that world fairly thoroughly, including John. But I'm trying to kind of explore how this sits a little bit with more recent work that I've been doing with physical modeling. So I wouldn't see what I've done there as physical modeling. It's very kind of, it has physical aspects, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a bit, but it's kind of, it's very naive physical modeling. If it is physical modeling, it's not modeling any specific real scenario or testing any particular hypothesis about acoustics. And I'm thinking more and more about how it isn't physical modeling, because I've been doing a lot of work with actual physical models recently. And this is the kind of contrast I'm presenting. So we've got chaotic synthesis and physical modeling. The left-hand side, this is what we just heard, a kind of example of the gutter synthesis. On the right is some more recent work I've been doing with the NES physical models, which was a big research project at Edinburgh that I was not involved in. I'd come very late to this when the project was already done. But this is in the acoustics department there, in a project led by Professor Stefan Bilbao, where they've been making some very sophisticated finite difference-based physical models that come out of acoustics research. So that work's really rooted in understanding acoustic instruments thoroughly enough to be able to test how well you understand them through the implementations of your equations in a synthesis environment. And obviously it's useful that it is then potentially a system that composers can use too, but it feels like it's motivated just as much by the kind of scientific research as it is a synthesis method. And this is where I've been trying to think about this in general, about physical modeling as digital synthesis process. It's a really interesting one. Was anyone here at the Ghent Symposium on Simulation and Sound Art?
No, but a friend of mine was there.
Right. I presented some of this at that and tried to talk about it in that context. And it was interesting, John talked about this, like synthesis as simulation of something. And here it very literally is, it's about this kind of tied to the word simulation as it could be. But yet, they make speakers move around and sound comes out of the speakers, and that has its own life in a sense. And so those questions of authenticity definitely really kind of come to the front with physical modeling. And it's an interesting one to think about in terms of, I think, heresy probably. Because as a digital synthesis practitioner, which is what I think I might be, one of the most heretical things is for it to sound like an acoustic instrument probably. Like if you go to play a big festival like Mutech or this kind of world of, contemporary electronic music in that domain, if you turn up and it sounds like a bunch of trumpets, it's going to sort of, it's not going to feel like but with this digital electronic music, it doesn't sound like that. But these processes, which are completely digital, completely in the box, can sound like that, and that feels like it. I mean, obviously, physical modeling's been around for a while, but I'll play some excerpts anyway, which will make it a bit clearer. But so this slide is slightly recapping what I just said. We have slightly different motivations, possibly across the two, and these slides it's still me trying to think about it. So there's not necessarily concrete facts on this sheet. So, like I say, the right-hand side, physical modelling. It particularly in this case, has come out of acoustics research. Having an anechoic chamber with instrument in it and measurement mics, so you can take very careful measurements, and then using that to build mathematical models, then implementing those mathematical models as synthesis systems that hopefully allow you to show how closely your graph of what the synthesis did is close to what the actual instrument, how it responded to those same kind of input situations. Whereas the chaotic synthesis stuff, which at the moment feels like a long way away from this maybe, I'm particularly kind of pointing at research that's explored mathematical systems in a different way, so taking dynamical systems like Lorentz attractors, Duffing oscillators, logistic maps, this kind of work where you explicitly have a kind of chaotic system which has all these unruly behaviors and makes potentially very erratic sounds and can be very uncontrollable and difficult to use, and this kind of thing, which you kind of get in any kind of feedback system to an extent anyway, because there's obviously a close link between these iterated equations and the nature of feedback. And I guess the observation isn't that insightful, but these really are peas in a pod. That the chaotic synthesis is these implementations of these kind of iterative dynamical systems, and so are physical models. It's kind of the same thing in a way. The physical modeling involves taking these differential equations and implementing them. It just comes from a very different background and has very different drives, but you can get a lot of the similar interactions with both methods, which links back a little bit to what I said at the start about the motivation for using chaotic synthesis, because I've been trying to play with acoustic players and was sort of failing with the computer to do anything effective. So it's this discretization of some kind of differential equation is one model. That's the kind of approach definitely they're taking at Edinburgh with the NES project. It's this very finite difference approach as opposed to something like waveguides that Julius Smith came up earlier. That's something he's really developed well. Yeah, so I'm trying to kind of just draw this parallel a little bit. I'll play some sound examples, which will help make it a bit more concrete probably. So this is just the chaotic oscillators that are built into Supercollider. I don't know who actually made these. It's a kind of collaboration. Yeah, that's what I had in my head. Yeah, as in CK comments. I'll play a clip anyways. This is just those fairly off the shelf. So yeah, I'm sure some people are familiar with these kind of processes. If not, you can get Supercollider going. Just open the examples for those two UGens, and you'll be in that terrain very quickly.
Lance Putman.
Say it again, sorry?
Lance Putman.
Ah, okay.
2004.
Lance is that?
Lance.
Okay, thanks.
It's in the
This
sources. It's all in the sources.
I had a look, but anyway, I'm obviously too lazy to actually find the reference. This is a slightly older piece by Intuk Choi, who works a lot with Chua circuits, which is in a similar world of kind of nonlinear dynamical systems. Property of these systems is that they are obviously non-linear, but they have the potential to sort of hit these critical points at which the system undergoes a kind of significant transformation to something else, and from which you might not be able to go back to the original state very easily. And you could hear that in some of the examples when it kind of hops into this other state slightly. And that kind of interaction, I think, is really interesting to think about in the context of acoustic instruments. So you get things, for example, with a clarinet. You can imagine if you have a particular note that you're playing and you overblow to the point where you jump to a higher harmonic, you kind of crush that threshold. And what that allows you to do is you can back off back to the original breath pressure, but stay in your new regime. You can keep that higher harmonic and come back to exactly the state of the inputs you had previously, but be in a different place. So you have the possibility of exploring not just the state of all your inputs at any one time, but the possibility of pushing into new states, and then potentially your whole interface changes into something that reacts very differently in that new state. And that's the kind of critical property, I think, ties these together as systems to interact with. And I don't know if that's normally the language people would couch their instrumental performance in, but you really can kind of see it with these physical models. But I've not picked these two sound examples to show that particularly. I've kind of picked these to highlight just how far away the sounds of these things can feel, even though they're very similar implementations of nonlinear dynamical equations. So this is an excerpt of some work I've been doing with the NES guitar model. Digital synthesis, but it doesn't feel like that, and it sort of sidesteps into a different culture in the way you have to hear it. It's very hard to listen to that and think about digital synthesis, for me anyway, because you almost have to picture a physical person doing these things, because it has so many of these little artifacts and mutes and sort of odd little things that you would get with an actual instrument. It's very strange to be using digital synthesis processes where that's the output. But that's slightly not the topic I'm kind of talking about today, but I think it's interesting in the context of heresy to think about that in digital synthesis. I'll play quickly the other one, which is brass model rather than guitar model. This, I think, is slightly easier to hear as digital synthesis. Yeah, I think it is quite fun working with brass because it's, I mean, I shouldn't say this because there's probably brass players in the room, but there's something inherently funny about brass, I think. Or it's hard to get away from that, particularly when you can't play it very well, which you can't with these physical models. They're very hard to play, and I don't know how to play a trumpet anyway, or any kind of brass instrument, how to get a note from the list of input parameters. It's very difficult to output a stable note. So yeah, you know, you have this team that worked on these models for many years, an algorithmic composer coming along working on it, and it can sound like a 5-year-old kind of messing around with a tuba, but in a good way, hopefully. Anyway, I should talk a bit about the actual, you guys can play all the examples, about the actual gutter synthesis, which is trying to take elements from physical modeling and bring them into the chaotic synthesis so that the result can kind of spread a bit from, you know, I like the explicitly digital sound, but I like the fact of having the continuum between that and the slightly more sort of acoustic behaviors. So that's where it's physically inspired. It's definitely not physical modeled. Am I doing all right time-wise?
Oh yes, you're doing fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. Cool. So I'll talk through this briefly, but I probably won't go into it too far. So I was talking about people using these fairly off-the-shelf kind of dynamical systems that are often set up, like the Duffing oscillator is the one I've been using, which is it's a model of resonance in some ways, so it slightly has a physical model aspect. That's the continuous version of the differential equation on the right. And a bit like some of these implementations of things like the Lorentz, it involves getting the next sample from the previous sample according to some set of rules, or possibly the previous two samples. So it's a kind of iterative feedback thing. And then you just feed, say, the X term directly to the speaker. This adds, I mean, it's not a huge innovation to do this. It's in lots of different kind of feedback models in a way. You know, if you wave around a microphone in front of the speaker, you kind of get this in a way. But to pass it through a bandpass filter bank, just to slightly tether it to particular frequencies that you can then control a bit more directly, which is a bit like having something like the chaotic behavior of a reed and tethering it to a tube, or the chaotic interaction of a bow and tethering it to a string. It has some correlate there, but it's not a model example of that situation. And it's happening at sample rate, so each sample is pushed through the filters before it can return back to the kind of iterative equation. And that already gives you, that's a single oscillator instantiation. But the software that we heard an example of at the start, and that I'll demo very quickly in a minute, is a kind of network of these, which again is a fairly common thing to do with feedback. You have one feedback loop, you think, what would happen if I mix this in with a different feedback loop and allow them to influence each other and that kind of thing. So these can do that. They work quite neatly in a network of 8, where the output of each controls the sort of damping parameter on all of the others. So yeah, I'll pause there to maybe show it in the software. And hopefully it's try and hit some of these kind of transition points to show how it can sort of slip into these different modes and behaviors, which then give you a different terrain to explore. So I should probably... So that's the kind of interface. It's fairly stripped down. And so you can download this if you want and try it out. And it's kind of fun to do that, particularly in the context of the discussions around, have I made a composition or have I made a synthesis environment, or where's the boundary? It's kind of interesting to have people use it. So you can get the patch, it's a max patch, or you can get the standalone. So you can kind of hear the distinct oscillators there, all kind of behaving by themselves, where these separate frequencies that are kind of moving around, simplified slightly. One of the ways you can get that kind of interaction where you go past a critical threshold where it changes behavior and then you can come back and work with it is in the oscillator interaction parameter. So if I push this, it starts to do that thing I showed very briefly on the slide where each influences each other, and they kind of form more of a homogeneous block. together. And I mean, this is where it gets, I think anti-science was in the call. I don't know exactly why or what's going on, and that's fine. So yeah, they seem to form this, they kind of lock each other in this center, and they hear them almost trying to escape, but not quite getting there. And slightly dragging the tone around. Apart again and decide to go their own ways. I'll try and show a simpler example as well of that kind of interaction. So this is the separate ones for each of the 8 oscillators in this version. I just turn off all of these apart from one of them. So this is a single oscillator. Just let it sort of self-modulate a little bit. That's me just randomizing the filter bank. I'm going to try and just get it to do that thing where I can, a bit like overblowing on the clarinet, push it into a different harmonic state and come back to where I was. So I'm going to try and do that with a damping parameter. So I'm going to reduce the damping. Never do a live demo. I should have brought a video. Oh, in fact, there are videos. There's some on Vimeo that I can put the link up to. Let's send it into a more chaotic release anyway. You can sort of see quite a distinct threshold there, and I can pull back a little bit there to the point before I hit that threshold, and then slightly move around in that terrain. I'm just going to keep failing to find these points, but at least we heard it with the oscillator interaction. And yeah, that's slightly the nature of the beast, I suppose. If you set up this kind of a system, that it's going to be hard to get it to do the thing you want it to do when you want it to do it. Anyway, the link, if you want to find it, if you just go to, probably if you just go to my website, which is myname.co.uk, there is somewhere on the projects, gutter synthesis, and that'll take you to the page with the download if you do want to try it. Otherwise, I think I'll shut up at that point and see if there are any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tom. Very interesting. Questions?
Yes. Do you prefer a specific method for discretizing the difference equations? Differential equations?
This is where I'm going to expose my slight ignorance. I've been using just a sort of simple time-stepping method. I tried it sort of 4th order Runge cutter, and it seemed not as interesting, even though I think it's more accurate in the way it's kind of discretizing the equation, but I'm slightly at my depth there, so yeah.
So you preferred a sort of more naive method in a way?
Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, yeah, was there a particular... Oh.
No, the questioner.
Sorry. So you preferred a more naive method in the end?
I didn't have a choice back then because I didn't know what I was doing.
Okay.
And it was only later I thought to try another integration method.
Okay.
I'm starting to learn more about that myself, partly to keep up with the physical modeling team, which are, they're so far into this, it's intimidating. But it's fairly naively done, But so I can't say for sure that we're hearing exactly the sonification of that exact system because of the way I've discretized the equation,
Sounds great.
Thanks,
Just in case anybody wanted a microphone. Hello?
Is it because that's different? Well, I know, it should be right, right? Oh, I turned it down.
Okay. Hello? Hello, yes. Okay, so if somebody wants, maybe we can hear it better, especially on the video then. You were...
That's the question.
Me?
Yes, when you...
I wouldn't.
Well, I just had a practical question of, I got a shout. About the Max patch. It looked very interesting, but it seems that the 64-bit version is not in the drawbacks anymore. Do you know that the 32-bit version works with new
The 32,
versions?
it does for me, but I've had lots of people say it didn't, which is why I put up what I hoped was a 64-bit version. The standalone version might be okay though, but I guess if you want to poke around with it. Did you download, so you downloaded a 64-bit patch just now?
No, it just says that files are there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you can get to that. Interesting. Okay, I'll look into that. But if you send me an email, I can send you it. It's just, I'll just put my email. Yeah, so if anyone's failing to get it, you can email me. I can send it to you.
Sorry, John?
It sounds so acoustic. You were right, the first piece you played. Such a sort of...
The guitar or the
Oh,
guitar?
bowing. It's you know, having played double bass.
Yeah, it is quite double bass.
But the psychoacoustic effect of that, like you were saying, is quite striking. That we do think in our heads instrument, don't we? It's so good, actually. It's so acoustic. I was so impressed with the sound of that. In terms of it feeling acoustic, but not. Particularly when, like you said, then you start getting some of those harmonics, and, which gave it away, and made it something else.
It's the resonance that tends to morph between the two. The higher the resonance, the more it sounds like it's rattly and acoustic. But as that comes down, it unlocks the chaotic regimes. They can kind of do their thing a bit more, and it kind of hits the explicitly digital stuff. Yeah. But particularly in relation to the physical modeling, I haven't quite worked out what I'm doing or why that's interesting, but I feel like that's a really fun space to be in, digital synthesis of things that are impossible to hear as digital synthesis, or difficult at least.
I remember my question.
Okay.
I was wondering how much you can determine the pitch of the chaotic system beforehand.
Good question. I mean, it's the filters that are doing most of it, but you could hear even just as some of the other parameters were changing. It's sort of bent, but you can, with this software, give it a specific frequency list if you want, which is that set of bandpass filters. But you might not get those exact frequencies, but it'll give it more likelihood, and the more the resonance goes up, the more you're likely to as well. But it's tricky to. Well, it's not that hard to tune, in fact. Some of the pieces I did were much more tuned. Just see if I can find an example of that. But they still kind of, as you push things like the oscillator interaction, it can sort of waver and drift.
And this is played live now, or?
This is it's just one take, kind of me faffing around with the patch, and then someone's mastered it as well, so it sounds nicer than it would have. But
just a clarification. I think you said this, but I missed it. But the feedback coming after the filter going back into the oscillator. What oscillator parameter is it controlling?
Oh, I see. When it goes back in, so it's the next term. So if you imagine this as an iterated equation where you're getting xn plus 1 based on xn, it's coming back in as a function of xn, basically. So, it comes back into the map that way. Is that
that
what you're asking?
Yeah.
But slightly misleadingly on this, the interaction between oscillators is not doing that. That is influencing the damping coefficient, which is delta in that equation. So it sort of scales delta based on the incoming audio, constrained between 0 and 1.
And everything is at audio rates.
Yeah, exactly. It falls apart without that. That's how it really works. Yeah.
If I were wanting to implement this, is there some kind of documentation?
Yeah, that's a good question. No is probably the short answer, but I should do that. I think. Yeah, do that because it's something I should do anyway, just so it doesn't just die as one of many projects that were a thing and no one could ever find out about them. And yeah, that's
because like I think it's very worth doing this as a standard oscillator somewhere, because it has this strange effect of being almost pitch related. So
yeah.
it'd be worth.
No, that's a good point. It'd be great if you do, or someone emails me just to remind me that. Yeah. And also so someone can tell me, you know, possibly the things I don't know or what it's doing that I've implemented the digitization one way rather than another. So it'd be good so yeah, just to open it up for those kind of questions, basically. Thanks.
I want to get rid of this. I'm sorry. I feel it's too much.
We're being threatened by the microphone. It's like that. It's like that low pass filter that is threatening the street. Yes. Any more questions? I'd just like to say that one thing that I kind of like about it is the idea of getting this kind of oscillator that, in essence, you get several outputs, or you have two outputs, and that it's a kind of multi-output oscillator, and they're so bound together, the two outputs, and so the whole idea of having oscillators with many bound together outputs, I think, is rather nice. If you don't want just the kind of old oscillator style of world where you just got, you know, the one output, I feel that that's really musically very interesting. Anything else? No?
In kind of analog world, is that not just a summing issue? When you increase the interaction between all the oscillators, does that change the relationship in terms of how they all mix these signals? Could that be dynamic as well? Because then you'd lose this fighting against each other. But is it because they're not summed properly in the outputs?
The fighting?
Yeah.
You mean? Good question. Actually, one thing I didn't mention is in the feedback loop there's about 2,000 samples delay, which means it doesn't stabilize as easily as it would, I think. It kind of keeps it moving. As one, you know, it can never quite hit stability. Yeah, because I did try just direct, but it didn't seem as interesting. It didn't do that kind of rattly, undulating thing as much. But wait, that wasn't quite the question. The question was...
Oh, there's something with the interaction between the oscillators.
Okay, yeah, so like the way they influence the damping. Why did I do that rather than some other kind of feedback summing?
Yeah. Well, it's how because it reaches a point where they become one.
Right, okay.
Is this a summing of all the interactions between them all? Or
I don't really know what's going on in that kind of combined thing where they all... I don't know why they would lock frequencies, for example. They all have randomized frequencies, so they don't have the same in the filter banks. And I don't know why locking the damping really controls the frequency so much. Why it's so kind of like entrained or something. Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, I wasn't very good at that.
Possibility for PhD.
Say it again?
There's a possibility for a PhD, not yours, maybe.
Right.
But
Yeah, no. Yeah. But it could just be something really simple. And after 2 months you go, oh, it's just because you did this. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll move on. Thank you very much, Tom. So the next is